we had, really a pleasure, real pleasure, because we are going to have with us Arnaud de Servigny, who has a really long experience in the field that many of us are, we would like, to adventure it. And the endeavor that we are going to start in the financial sector would be really even richer and with more insight if we have, some information and some experiences from the people who have been in this field and have gone through really the troubles, some complicated, moments. And this is why we wanted really to have, the experiences of Arnaud. Arnaud, I owe you an apology. You know, when I was sharing the news that you are going to attend and you had accepted, to join us, I presented you as Arnaud Versini. Actually, Mr. Versini is my neighbor at home. Okay, thank you so much, Arnaud. I wanted to present you, but there was already your bio in the news that we shared. But I want to just to tell you give you a hint about the institutions that Arnaud has went into the thing. So. Well, from which one I start? Every single bank, that's really is weighing in the landscape of financial world. Arnaud has been there. So institutions. So I start with BNP Paribas. Then we go to Barclays. Then we are talking about Deutsche Bank. And some, for example, the rating agencies, which is the most important, Standard Poors. So and Arnaud also he has he does not only doing business. He's not only making money for himself and for his institutions, but also Arnaud is also sharing his experience to the students. So he is adjunct professor at Imperial College in London. Do you still teaching there, Arnaud?
Yes, I am.
Awesome. So I suppose so some people who are coming along to ask you for your next courses. Okay. So but now Arnaud is the CEO of Queensfield AI Technologies, and what is we are going to really to listen is about how navigate through crisis and a little kind of really the kind of insight about the financial industry during the troubles times. Thank you so much, Arnaud.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be with you tonight, and maybe I'll start giving you some ideas of what I came through during my life. But of course, what is interesting is after to have an open discussion. Okay, so in fact, to start, maybe what I'll do is to start from the beginning, without going into too many details, but try to link it with the environment in which I have been. So I did some sort of French engineering school, and at the end of it, I decided that I didn't want to go to the finance. In fact, after that, I did a master, which was between HEC and Dauphine, and after that, decided I didn't want to go to finance. I wanted to do something useful in life and contribute to society.
Well done.
And as a result, I had a wonderful and peculiar experience in the sense that I went to a cement company, and I had the chance to manage around 450 blue collars. So it was really on the ground. It was in the end in Belgium. In fact, I was half Belgian, and I'm married with my Belgian wife there. It was a good experience, and I think that this is something that has always been useful in my life, because in fact it has given me the capability to interact with people and be able to manage people with some credibility, and not only do things by my own, but also be able to consider people to make sure that they work nicely, etc. Not always good at that, but in fact I learned something. It all ended up because in fact, at the time, the cement industry was working like a cartel. That means that all the competitors were working together to define prices, volumes, and things like that. And that was not something sustainable. So I decided to move away from that, to go back to something that was more intellectually challenging. And it was at that time that I did a PhD. And for me, actually, a PhD is super important because I realized very early that when you're going to an international institution, you have a PhD or you don't have a PhD in quantitative analytics. So if you don't have a PhD, you're not considered in the Anglo-Saxon world as somebody really knowledgeable. Of course, London and New York have been accustomed to the French engineers being able to do some things, but still, what happens is that most of the time these people haven't had the habit or the opportunity to go into papers, read them, implement them, and things like that. I mean, they're smart people, but their knowledge, the library of knowledge that they have in their mind is rather limited. So to implement smart solution is good, but if you want to be a little bit more innovative, then this is something that requires to have spent some time doing a PhD. Now, I went through my PhD. I've been lucky at the time because, in fact, it was the beginning of quantitative credit, and I was on it by chance. And although I had spent several years completely outside of finance, so I thought, well, my friends who have been into finance directly know much more than I do. So what I did is, as a result of that, I decided that in quantitative credit, where I had some knowledge, better write a book rather than be the laggard. So in fact, the philosophy I had is, if you want to do something, try to be the expert. And if you are the expert in an institution, in a large institution, a lot of people are managers and things like that. They won't bother you. They will rely on you because they need some sort of expertise. So I wrote a couple of books, first in French and then in English. Right after the PhD, I went to BNP Paribas. At the time, it was the time of the merger between BNP and Paribas, so it was really complex inside the organization. So the sooner I could move away from this big French institution and go to a more entrepreneurial environment shop, I was happy. This is the result why after a year and a half, I moved to London because in fact, what I found at the time was that the large French institutions were very inward-looking, inward-focused, okay, not very open to the outside world. Very well organized, but in London, I moved to Standard & Poor's. The reason was was there, which is that, in fact, they needed some knowledge about or expertise about quantitative credit. It was not anymore just about assessing qualitatively the credit worthiness of firms, but trying to understand how to manage a credit portfolio and understand and quantify the risks. At the time, actually, it would all look new. This was the time of the Merton model, the various type of models. It all looked new. In fact, what happened also, and this is something that I found interesting, is that a few people exerted some sort of thought leadership, and in the end, all the community used the same models. Okay, and in fact, there was the I don't know, the model from Credit Suisse, the model from Riskmetrics, the model from etc. There were 4 or 5 models and varieties of them, and approach. Because in fact, what I realized is that in these institutions, people were quants, but it took them some time to really understand what the models were, and once they understood it, they really focused on it and didn't move away from it. Now, practically, I was at S&P between 2000 and 2005, 6, and I moved. The good thing with the American organization is that you were able to move along the ladder. I started really reasonably junior, and after 5 years, I was heading the quant group globally as an MD, etc. So that was quite interesting in terms of evolution. What I'd say is I left S&P in 2006 for one reason, which is that my expertise at the time was on dependencies, correlations. and it was the time of the Coppolas and things like that, and it was really interesting. And I went at some stage to my boss, and I told him, and I told her, there were two of them, that in my view, the rating of the structured product, the CLOs and things like that, were too volatile because we combined, in fact, the changes, the univariate changes on the ratings with a multivariate evolution, the dependency, the correlation, which was varying. And as a result of that, we needed, and in fact, all these products were very new. We were after the year 2000, and in fact, we'd seen the recovery from the 2000 crisis. We hadn't seen at the time a market downturn. And in fact, the problem was that in case of a market downturn, we didn't know how these structured products, these CLOs, CDOs, etc., would do. The understanding that we had after 3-4 years of data, gathering the data, was that the sensitivity to the regimes was quite high. So I went to my senior management and told them that in my view it was important to adjust the ratings for this ultra sensitivity. The response was, Arnaud, you are a nice guy, but do you think that we're going to change ratings on all these transactions for this big market and just because of you? Okay? And in addition to that, I had another point which was that there were firms that were called monolines, reinsurers, credit reinsurers, credit enhancers. And in fact, what they offered is you had an investment in credit, in a loan or in some debt, and you could buy some insurance from these type of firms, and the rating that you would have would move up by 1-2 notches or something like that. So you bought something that was double B, bought an insurance. As a result of that, you would go to a triple B or single A. Now, these insurers, these credit insurers, they were taking part of the risk. And so one of the things that I've been asked is to review the capital that was allocated to these firms to make sure that it was in line with the risk they were taking. We worked on all of this, and we came back to senior management to say they're undercapitalized, they need to raise more capital. And the answer was, why do you come to this conclusion while the guys at Moody's have found a model that works as is? Okay, so I left S&P in despair, not thinking that there would be any major crisis, but thinking that I'm completely useless. And
right timing.
What was the year?
Well,
2006.
Sorry?
It was 2006.
End of 2005, I moved to the beginning of 2006. But it was just the idea that it was useless, okay? And so I went to something my colleagues thought I was completely crazy, to private wealth management. When you are doing what was really fashionable at the time with all these credit derivatives and things like that, go into a place like this, but I wanted to manage money. So, and in fact it was at Barclays, and there had been a change in senior management, and the senior management wanted to make money for their clients instead of doing just marketing. And so they asked, I don't know why they offered me to come. What I know is that they didn't want to have sell-side quants, because in fact it's completely different turf with the risk neutral approach, etc., etc. They realized that they had to work with people who were in the empirical world and not on the risk neutral world. So, the chemistry worked well. I went there, arrived, thinking that there was a lot of things to do. Just one thing. In fact, to say before, at the end of S&P, I wrote a book which was the Handbook of Structured Finance. I went through all the major banks there, and asking for the magic formula to price a CLO. Because I understood really well how it worked from a rating perspective, but I didn't understand very well how the pricing was working. And in fact, there were a lot of complex models, etc. But what I realized while writing this book is that the pricing was this. There was no real model. There were a couple of Russian guys writing papers which were overly complex, but the reality is that it was unapplicable. So in fact, nobody cared, and it was just that. So I went to Barclays, and to be at the time, the people there wanted to build. The approach that they had was in fact, about selling the past. You had what is called a CAPM. You know, you had some sort of invariance optimization, whatever, or Black Litterman, of all this type. When you said I'm working with Black Litterman, at the time people said, "Wow, this is really complex," but this was just rubbish. And in addition to that, people were trying to spice a little bit things with what was called TA, tactical asset allocation, so balancing equity and bonds to create an overlay generating 2 or 3% of performance on top of things. And I worked on that, and in fact, the asset allocation, the traditional static asset allocation, X%, trying to find a magic formula between how much bonds, how much equities, etc., in the multi-asset portfolio, trying to optimize the past and showing the client how it would have been had we known the right asset, which we never knew. This was just bullshit. And then arrived quickly 2008. It was really interesting because, in fact, Barclays, the universe was around, I don't know, 80, 90 billion, so it was a large organization. We had an investment committee. What I remember was that in 2007, so 2007, we realized that we were ahead of a big crisis. Now, the difficulty is that when you are in a large organization, taking the risk to really shrink the risk within portfolios is difficult, and we were not equipped. In fact, these type of committees, when they shifted 2% the allocation in something, they said we've done a big job, but it didn't matter really at all in the portfolio. So in fact, when ahead of a crisis, you have to be prepared in terms of rules and possibility that you have in the management of portfolios to gain some leeway. Because when you're close to the crisis, it's no more the time to change the rule. It has to be done before. So we were, 2007, we realized that we were ahead of a crisis. We tried to move a little bit the allocations, but not much. By the way, aside that, there is something I didn't mention, which is that when I was at the S&P, one part of my job was to create some ratings for SMEs, small and medium-sized enterprises. At the time, we collected the data. I built my first machine learning models using logistic regression and SVM. So SVM was quite advanced in early 2000, and it was called Credit Risk Tracker. It was a competitor to RiskCalc, which is still survived. And I launched at Imperial the Master of Risk Management and Financial Engineering. So I co-launched it with William Paradine, a friend of mine, and we didn't know whether it would be a good success. Now there are more than 100 students per year, so it's a good success. And what do I want to say? So going back to Barclays, what happened when we came to 2008 was that we thought that we could manage in the portfolios with hedging and on options and things like that. And one of the things that we realized is that it was very interesting. At the beginning we could hedge, but then the cost of hedging was too high. Okay, so there was no ability to use derivatives anymore to hedge. So that was tough because there was nothing that could be done. Yeah.
It's because of the regime at that time, or it was something that you were?
No, it was because it was just too expensive. So in fact, the premia that we had to pay were just unjustifiable at the time. You don't know how much it's going to collapse, etc. So you're saying, okay, no, now we've gone to a certain level. It's no more going to go down. But we didn't realize especially there is one thing to understand, which is that people who were working with traditional liquid assets didn't know the more illiquid credit assets. So they didn't realize the extent of the issues. They didn't realize that the banks were struggling to refinance and all the stuff that we've learned since then. So it's like now, in a way, if you think of the knowledge that people in more liquid assets have of private equity, private debt, it's fairly limited. So if there is anything happening there, it will come as a surprise. It's level of regulation is lower, the understanding of everybody is lower. Actually, it started already to be pushed into retail. The retail people have got no clue about what they're investing in, and it is something that could be an issue. So went through this 2008 crisis. Actually, what I learned there was one thing, which is never sell tail risk to retail clients. In fact, the portfolios of many clients were stuffed with structured products, which were sold as quasi-fixed income. But what they didn't realize is that they collected the premium, but at the expense of a drawdown, and they had to be, they were selling some insurance, and they were to fund the losses of others, and they didn't realize that, and so it was some sort of big selling. And I remember there were a couple of things. People saying, these are all what I've set aside for my pension. The volatility cluster in which we discussed was between, 5 and 8%. We're at 15%. This is not what I asked for. The value of all what I have is awful. Then there were all these stories about gates, which were a bit more spicy asset. But even in what we saw in money market funds, some of that because of RMBS were gated, and people thought they had some liquid assets, and now it was not the case. Actually, it's very surprising that this year, the regulators have asked all the fund managers to implement gates, and said, if you don't want to implement gates in your funds, you have to justify this. And this is something that is quite surprising. It's understandable why they're doing it, but that means that investors don't have in mind the idea that their fund could be gated much more than they think. And this is, so in passing, this is something that that could correspond to a surprise. Now, 2009, so personally during this period, I went through a burnout personally, okay? So that was really difficult because you had all the clients coming to you to say, what is going on with my money? What is going on with my life and things like that. In addition to that, the product had been there for several years. I was not responsible starting in 2006 for all what had been done, but people didn't care. They just wanted making sure that their money was preserved and wanted information. The other thing I learned there is that when you're in the middle of all of this, it's super important to communicate with clients. Don't stay on your side, because when you don't took the natural situation is to really hide and say nothing, which is the worst that can happen, because you think that you just manage yourself, but the anxiety of people on the other side is growing, and when they come back to you, it's not in good shape. So really making sure that communication is there, making the effort. Basically, as portfolio managers, we are like Ulysses, okay? That is, when there are some things that people want to do, we fix ourselves to the mast and make sure that we don't dive to see the
Siren.
No, it's the sirene, but I don't know how you say that. I can't remember how you say that. And in addition to that, mermaids, exactly. We are, as portfolio managers, our job is to take the stress of clients. They delegate to us because they don't want to have the stress, and they want us to carry the stress. So it is our job to do that and to inform them and reassure them about what we're doing. So that was it. What was in really quickly, what happened after that is it was very difficult to come back to the market in 2009. Okay, so when you have a model, you built a nice model, the nice pop model that says, go back to the market in March 2009 full speed, that doesn't work. It will never work. Okay, nobody will go for it. There is too much to be lost, and emotionally people are not prepared. It's actually, when you look at what happened, you first tiptoe on lower risk like credit, you then go on equity after the summer of 2009. Of course, there may be a few hedge funds doing things a bit earlier, but the majority of people went really carefully after that. It was shell shock. And in addition to that, what I'd say, what 2008 told us is what 2022 reminded us, which is that when there is a market shock, the diversification across asset classes doesn't work. So you have your magnificent optimizer, mean variance optimizer is just rubbish. Okay? And we've seen that in 2022, because in fact when rates are going up and things like that, or this year, when the rates are going up, it's very difficult to find asset classes which are outperforming. Everybody is really under stress. So that was it. We worked at the time. We kept on working on the TAA. I had a nice team of people really in machine learning, people coming from NCMAG and other areas, trying to build something. At that time, one of the things that I learned, and that is part of my DNA, is so it's interesting as a background. I do not believe in factor models. Okay, why? Because in fact, what we did for two reasons. First reason, I had some friend at GSAM at the time, Goldman Sachs Asset Management, and there was this fund which was Global Alpha, and basically the guys there, his name is quite a famous Kahad. They really were from the School of Chicago, and the School of Chicago is really about the explanatory Fama French, the explanatory factors and things like that. But in 2007, it didn't work anymore. And so it went bust for that reason, because they tried to leverage to make it, to take more risk in order to try to find some juice. What we did on our side is that we took whatever we could take in terms of factors in data stream, so public information, and looked at the predictive power of these factors. There were 800 of them and something like that, and we went through variations of them to understand what was the predictive power of these factors. And what we realized is that the stability of the predictive power of the factors, of the features, was not there. There were only 5% of the feature which had some sort of stable predictive power. So we implemented at the time some HMM and things like that to try to understand regimes, etc. But it was very difficult. And in fact, I remember always one explanatory factor for the dynamics of the S&P 500 was the number of cars sold in South Korea. So not something that is super intuitive. So I'm not saying that everybody shares my view, but based on what I've seen, I'm a bit skeptical of a set of models, a set of features, an outcome, and trying to find the best model. Why? Because in fact, it's something, when you look at the psychology of the market, what happens is that the market is an aggregate of investors, which is not stable. Sometimes some investors are at play, sometimes other investors are at play. And so that means that the risk aversion of this group is not stable over time. And the way these people understand the market and risk changes. So for example, central bank is providing liquidity. Is that good or is that bad? Sometimes it can be good, sometimes it can be bad. So in fact, that shows that this factor is not going to provide some sort of stable signal. So went through that. In fact, after that, my boss at the time asked me to move with him to Deutsche Bank. when I was when I went to Deutsche Bank, I thought I don't know whether some of you are Deutsche Bank, but at the time I thought, well, I'm going to go with the crazy people. So what I did, I had the view, it was in 2010, that machine learning was going to be a game changer. So one of the things I did was to work on a robot to trade on Betfair, to really understand what was going on there. In fact, I launched on my own personal money a competition on Kaggle to really understand how people would work. Working with horses was not something that was prevented, because it was not on financial market, I could do it. In fact, I learned a lot through this experience. First of all, the idea that the price is a probability of outperformance. So when you think of a price of an asset, of equities or something like that, you say, you know, the price of Nestle is this. No, the price of Nestle, in fact, has got some hidden information, which is that it expresses the preferences of investors of on Nestle over Parmalat. And so trying to understand what are the hidden probabilities that are expressed through the prices. The second thing I learned is that models are as good as they are for a certain period of time. And what we realized is that the initial model that we built were doing well at the beginning, and their value was fading over time. Okay. Because in fact there were other people working on smart models with perhaps better information than we had, and as a result of that, it was tough to outperform. So in fact, this is something that you don't have. I realized it there. You don't have that when you're working on something, for one reason, which is that apart if you're working in some sort of esoteric hedge fund, everybody uses the same type of models. And in fact, you are in competition with people who, if you want to make money, who are smart, who are trying to have a view. So in fact, in order to make money, one has to have some sort of lateral thinking that is not aligned with the other people. And it has to be quite unique. So, and I'd say one of the things that I realized is that actually machine learning was something that enables us right now to express lateral thinking. Not everybody has got the same models anymore. CAPM is dead. In fact, all the pricing of options, etc., doesn't interest many people anymore. I'm sorry, I'm going a bit quickly there. And people are trying to extract value and trying to be smart in a different manner. So I think that has been something interesting. Now, I had at Deutsche Bank, I had can't remember how many, 250 portfolio managers working with me. There was a lot of management there. It was interesting. It was 125 billion. But I wanted to be more on the innovation side than being a manager. So in fact, this is where I left. And I went back to Paris. I didn't want my kids to be pure English people. So I went back to Paris too. And decided to work into the space. This has been a tough experience for different reasons. When you are in a large organization, you're a bank employee, whatever the level. So I thought, well, when I'm going to be a director, I'll have some sort of responsibility. I'll have some more autonomy. When I'm going to be an MD, I'm going to have some more autonomy. In the end, I was managing 30 MDs and no autonomy. Now, when you go into a small organization, you're you, yourself, and your cat, and things are going more slowly. And in addition to that, what I realized is that the finance industry was very traditional. People didn't want to take any risk. They want to have some magic returns without doing things that are fully explainable like the others are doing, and that doesn't work. And I think also, I'd say something which is politically not correct here. What has happened, especially there has been some sort of divergence between the US and Europe, in the sense that Europe went full speed into ESG, that really occupied a lot of the bandwidth of senior management, and they didn't realize what was going on and what was happening, i.e. all the evolution towards more sophistication. While the US was much less on the ESG, I mean, I'm not to say that it's good or bad, and as a result, they were much more prepared for all what was related to AI. not all of them, because in fact, a lot of things related to retail, it remains very traditional. But still, there is a lot of smart money there, more than there is where we are. The other point too, I'd like to say, is that when you build something new, it requires an awful lot of time for you to be comfortable, and people who put money to be comfortable on what you do, making sure that it works, because when you do a back test or something like that, it's all done at once. When you go through the journey, the investment journey with the ups and downs, it is something that is difficult to leave. And it's very difficult to be hands-off and to say, I'm not going to tweak my model because in fact, I'm not happy with the results that are there. So you have got this challenge between upgrading your game, working on new technologies, and at the same time, making sure that you are not trying to gain emotional comfort by tweaking your model when you are not happy with it. So this is not very easy. I think that we've got, where I am now, we've got a good balance between young people and more senior people trying to work together, do their PhD, because in fact, if you don't do your PhD, and what I've been telling to people is that they know almost nothing. It's not completely true, but they learn a lot. In fact, and they realize how difficult it is to build something that is quite genuine and new. But now I think that this year is an interesting year with the evidence of ChatGPT and things like that, generative AI, with people realizing that it's going to change their life. And you can see senior management functions really realizing that this is something that has to happen, not know exactly how to do it. And by the way, I'd like to say something which is an observation, which is that with all the ESG things that has happened, the cost of production in asset management has increased by about 15%. Now, what happens is that up to now, the market has been going up to some extent, so the market effect is fairly positive apart from 2022. If we start to have a market that goes down, we'll have the cost up, and with inflation and things like that on top of it, and we'll have the revenues going down. So it's going to be a tough time where cost cutting will take place, but also re-engineering of the processes will have to happen to make sure that the processes and all the effort is more cost effective than it has been in the past. So this is an opportunity, but it's not a given because it's a traditional industry. I've said a lot.
Thank you. Arnaud. This is, really amazing to have such a generously, sharing your experience. We had so much insights. I wanted, to list them and just, share them. Now I lost some of them. But thank you so much, Arnaud. I suppose that I bet we have many questions to ask. I started with two already. I'm going to start it with a little journalistic anecdotal. Where were you on September 16th, 2008, at the bankruptcy of Lehman Brothers?
I was at Standard & Poors, and some colleagues in New York, they were not far away from
the Lehman Tower.
Yeah. Sorry, no, I was thinking the 9/11. When 2008. I can't remember. I can't remember it. I don't see 2008 as an event. I see 2008 as some sort of a continuum where it went down, down, down. I remember one thing, which is the head of the retail bank at Barclays saying things have now gone down sufficiently. I'm investing that much of my personal money in Barclays share because I believe that this is the end of it. So it was some sort of continuous event, and we had the feeling that it won't, it would never end. Actually, this is something that is very different from the COVID crisis, in the sense that during the COVID crisis, people said, great, there is a great opportunity to reinvest because it's going to bounce back very quickly. at that time there was no idea that it was going to bounce back, and people had lost confidence and trust in the rebound of the market.
Exactly. It lasted, I mean, at least 2 years, I mean, to go in 2010 and, and after, I mean, all this, that happened. Another question is that, just one kind of small story, what you said about the models and when they are not really become completely useless in some kind of environment like this. I recall, it is just, I mean, as a matter of, for a kind of cautionary story for us, you know, Nicole El-Kabi, in 2008, she was accused by many portfolio managers that her models were not working. And she had to come, if you recall, Arnaud, she had to come, I mean, in the news to, you know, just a quant, I mean, the best quant of France and even world, and to justify herself why her models were not working. And she explained, said that I recall, I mean, just like paraphrase, she said that I made this model, I mean, that you run with it with 100 kilometers per hour, and you were running with 500 kilometers per hour. Of course, it's not going to work. And you cannot ask us quants and just make us, I mean, responsible for the crisis. So just, I mean, beware. I mean, if there is a crisis, somehow they can come, I mean, behind everybody. So you just be, I mean, ready for that. If you wanted, I mean, to add something on that, because that was just what you said about, I mean, the regime.
I think that on models, we need to keep a skeptical eye, and secondly, a model can never be a standard. So if the model becomes the standard, what is the reality is the reality. What people are trying to do is to approach it, and in fact, at the end of it, people stopped of 2008. People stopped with the complex exotic products because they realized that under abnormal conditions, in fact, the models don't work. They work most of the time when things are benign, but when it is not benign, it doesn't work anymore. So people said, okay, there is too much complexity. There is always this topic about explainability and things like that, which is a good idea, provided that it doesn't constrain us too much in having some sort of naive approaches. Yes?
Yeah, I have a question. I want to thank you for experience, for sharing with us experience in finance. So I'm going to get back to the start of your speech about the PhD. So you mentioned at the last, it was important to do a PhD, but if you look in 2000, it's always important to have PhD to go to hedge funds. But right now, there is not much that constraint. So what do you think about that? Why PhD is always important to have in hand?
I think that it's true that things are evolving quickly, and that in a way what happens 3 years after you've done something may not be as relevant. But what I'd say is that, listen, with all the packages that exist, in fact, if people think that being users of packages make them great quants, they're wrong. Because in the end, it's going to be a guy with you know 2 years of university being able to use the package. And in fact, we really need when you're doing a PhD, going in front of your peers of senior people, trying to show them that you have understood something that is quite unique and which is not something that is trivial or expected. So I'd say, and in addition to that, what you do is you open up to a lot of papers and things like that. So in fact, one of the things I realized at my time was this, that especially when we were working on correlations, the people who had just gone out of university, traditional master and things like that, of course they could work with traditional correlation, even Pearson, even the type of things. But when it was about copulas and things like that, they didn't spend any time on this. So they had in their mind the standard library on the topics. It was very difficult for them to expand beyond that. And what this time does is that it gives you the opportunity to go laterally, to really visit what people have been doing in other fields perhaps than finance,
and apply this to solve a problem. You know, for example, today, if we're trying, I mean, we have a literature on machine learning that is not very much focused on finance. So if we are able to look at things related to audio signals, to things like that, well, I mean, a lot of people are on NLP, but other things like that, and try to see what can be leveraged and what kind of ideas can be taken away from this to build new kinds of models and things like that. This is something that is interesting. I'd add another thing, and after that I shut up. When you look at the evolution in machine learning of what has been taking place, actually, if I look at the beginning of my lecture, you start with the models, with the neural nets and things like that. When you move along the way, you have a lot of work that is being done on preprocessing of the data, okay? The LSTM, whatever you want, and things like that. The attention models, etc. In fact, what it means is that a model is never something where you dump data and you try to find good results. The work on the data in order to purify it, to make sure that it is good quality and things like that is super important. So for instance, if you have some data, but you have never used wavelets and things like that, the quality of your data is going to be very noisy. This is the type of thing, all the breadth of knowledge is the type of thing that you will have the opportunity to learn during your PhD while playing with this. And in fact, when you are, you've just finished your course at university, what happens? I know it because I you know, final lecture, okay, let's go to the transformer, and everybody, nobody understands exactly what it is because it's not going to be on the exam because it's the last lecture. And you're really good at logistic regressions, really good at things intermediary, but the breadth of knowledge you have is fairly limited. But smart people, but in fact you haven't got, and you're competing with people who have got that type of breadth.
Yeah, thank you. That's a good question.
Mm-hmm.
Before I mean the next question I have, I'm going to ask you, Arnaud, a question that nobody has ever asked you. What is your take on crypto?
I've never answered that type of question. In fact, I didn't. Maybe I'm going to say something that is politically not correct. But you remember that what I said at the beginning, and that asks a lot of questions. But what I said at the beginning is I didn't want to go into finance because I wanted to do something useful to society. Okay? Maybe in a naive manner. But I understand how cryptos can be useful to society, especially when there is governments that are trying to control everything. Mm-hmm. But I didn't understand how arbitrage on cryptos was something that was very useful to society. Okay, so in fact, it's not that I'm saying it's bad or wrong, but it's not something for me.
Perfect. That's a really fair answer.
Mm-hmm.
Questions on?
I have one about capital allocation. So you mentioned black litter money is garbage, and you also mentioned that in times of crisis, mean variance is useless. Yeah. So what is the opposite of that?
So in fact, the reason why I said that is because I didn't find anybody able to explain to me how to estimate the covariance matrix on what type of data and things like that. And what I realized is that, in fact, I wrote a book on this. It is that there are regimes in the equity market, and when you're trying to average 80% of growth period with 20% of down periods to find an average correlation matrix, the covariance matrix, it doesn't work very much. And depending on you're never going to get a proportion, right? So it's easy. So, in fact, there is one thing here, which is that when people have been working on this, it was under the assumption, the IID assumption, that is, we can work on distributions. It is sufficient. We don't need to have a look at the time dimensions of the time series. Mm-hmm. And in fact, what we've learned since then, and it's the reason why NLP is interesting in this field and things like that, is that time series are sequential.
So not using sequential models is something that is not good. I mean, for instance, random forest using that is interesting, but it doesn't. You've got no guarantee that the universe on which you're working is going to be relevant, because the time dimension, the sequentiality is not taken into account. Taking that sequentiality into account is something that really matters.
Even in the asset allocation.
In the asset allocation. Now, the difficulty is that people would like to have yearly stable asset allocation, but crises do not work on a year-by-year basis.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yes.
For you, what is the reason for the European aversion to innovation?
What I'd say is this: it is that a lot of the people are fixed income investors and not equity investors. In fact, if you look at institutionals like pension funds that don't exist very much in France, but insurance companies and things like that, they will invest in real estate, they will invest in debt, but they will tiptoe into equities, and that's it. So, in fact, as a result of that, they're really risk averse. And when you're dealing with risk, and they've been forced out of it because of the negative rates, and they've had to go. In fact, it is interesting because they've not embraced equity risk. They've gone into private equity or private debt to really hide the volatility, because the prices are not daily. As a result of that, they were under the impression that it was not too volatile and it was acceptable. But the appetite for risk is not very high in Europe, and in addition to that, there is another thing that we've noticed, is that equity markets are just a mess. I mean, I take an example. The ticker SAN, S-A-N, what does it stand for? It stands for Sanofi and Santander. Okay? So you have to have the dot something to show the place where it's listed. So that means that in fact it is not completely a unified market, and that makes it and basically what has happened also was this. It is that until 5-7 years ago, people were making money playing small minus big, small cap, European small cap versus large cap. So they could remain very local, just playing on small caps, and the large shops wouldn't go very much large cap, small cap, and so it was something that was where the smaller shops, the smaller asset managers were focusing, and that they were make their living like this. Now, when it came to with tech, that people 10 years ago had to invest into the US, nobody wanted to invest into the US. And right now, today, if you want to say we invest into the US, people will say no, we invest globally, 80% US, 20% Europe, but we don't invest in the US directly.
So the thing is that we are many of our friends here. They have, the opportunity really to go further. In terms of the research, doing other masters and doing, a PhD. What are, for you, the promising fields in the field of AI in general? Let's not talk about really specifically about the field.
I think that it is actually, people have got to know who they are. If you're a user, don't go for a PhD. If you have got some unique intuitions, then you'll have plenty of tools to express these intuitions. Let me give you an example. Okay? One of the questions I asked myself is this: why do people who don't work seem to do better than people who work? So why on large cap does passive seem to be doing better than active management? Maybe because the fees are different, but yes, but it is something. And in fact,
here is my understanding. I'm not saying that it is right, but it's this. When I look at the price of an asset, the price of an asset combines future cash flows with a discount factor. Future cash flows correspond to fundamental analysis, trying to understand really the future of the firm. And basically the way I see the market is like a big mall where you've got plenty of shops. Each of the shop is a firm, and the firm is showcasing its future cash flows. And what happens is that people in the market walk in this mall and say, I trust Nestle more than Parmalat. Therefore, I'm going to discount Nestle more favorably than Parmalat. Now, if you're asking people, what is the discount factor? People are going to tell you the cost of capital, something like that. No, the discount factor really reflects the relative risk aversion of investors towards a stock. And actually, the derivative of the discount factor is the arbitrage risk aversion. So, in fact, when you look at the literature, this is the literature on pricing kernel and things like that, what have we got to say on the dynamics of the discount factor? So this is a research angle that is quite new. How are we going to express this? What type of tools, etc., etc., what type of data? This is something that is interesting. So this is an example of the fact that, first of all, you have to have some intuitions and work on that and come with something which is new, and then you'll use the tools as a way to express something that is new and come with some conclusions, being able to really funnel the data to the signals you're interested in.
That's really interesting. I mean, it's a field, really developing. So maybe, we take, we even passed, the limit of the time, but it was really so much, to learn. Please go.
All right, first, thank you very much for the talk. Thank you very much for all these insights about career, about personal and professional life as well. That was very interesting, I think, for me. And I have some questions. I will be quick on that. First, you were talking about the fact that you don't believe in a lot of things. So you don't believe in models in general, in asset diversification in case you get a shock on the market. And you also believe that we have to bet on machine learning all the time, that this was the lateral thinking because nobody was doing it in investment bank, and it's even the case now as for pricing. There's not a lot of machine learning there. Do you think machine learning is still the lateral thinking today, or as more and more people are betting on that and going in this direction, we need to find a new one?
Listen, I think, so when I said I don't believe in this, that looks rather negative. What I'd say is that I've been through various crises that showed me that you can't trust fully things when when the environment is getting more shaky. Okay, this is what I learned, and it's not because it is new. That is basically what happens is that the community of investors will factor in the innovation and will swallow it and will go over it. So this is the difficulty. What I'd say is that the toolkit corresponding to machine learning is very diverse. So at the end of my course at university at Imperial, generally students come to me and say, well, what we want to do is we want to apply this and that model to predict the return of this and that type of stocks. Very naive. Because in fact, this is something that will not work because it's too standard. You have to go through this step, and this is where I find this notion of the PhD being interesting, is that you have to find an angle people have not thought of. And in fact, machine learning, it gives you a wider toolkit to be able to express your intuition. Okay, but if you're coming completely mainstream, don't expect too much.
If I can go for another one, sorry. Really quickly, so I'm completely joining you on the idea to do a PhD because I was working as a quant at BNP and I resigned to go for a PhD that I'm starting now. And I just had this thinking in my mind about if you are the specialist within your team, within your career, as you mentioned at Standard Poors, the senior management wasn't really listening to you, and even you mentioned the fact that when you were leading MDs, you were also not free to do whatever you want or to impact the decision. So do you think maybe being this specialist in this environment was for you also a way not to be able to take those decisions freely? Maybe because people were a bit skeptical about all this knowledge that you have in mind, all this intuition you can have, or what is your?
I think that
thought about
it depends where you are. When you are, in fact, in traditional banks or traditional asset managers, they are not there to, in fact, if you look at it, you have a balance between marketing and performance. Okay, depending on the shops you're in, it's more focused on marketing, less on performance, or more focused on performance and less on marketing. Now, if you go full performance, you go to certain hedge funds, but then your lifetime in a hedge fund is may not be very long. Okay, because it's in and out. If you go to a retail money manager, basically we've seen that with ESG, thematics and things like that, marketing is more important. I'm not saying that ESG is just marketing, but the appeal that resonated with people was more related to understandable type of things. So it has to be, you have to find where to go depending on your skill. If you think that you're a genius, go to a hedge fund or build your hedge fund. If you think you're reasonably good, try to find an in between. If you think that you just want to show people that you're credible but apply some standard recipes, go to a retail shop. It depends on you.
Thank you. Okay. Thank you. Just very last question. Just, if you can answer it just with yes and no. Do you believe in efficient markets? We have 3 hours now. Midnight.
I don't believe in efficient markets. Okay, I think there is a degree of efficiency, but there is no full efficiency.
Perfect. That's a perfect answer, I think. Thank you so much. This is, I think really we started really in a very well. They are guests. For the future. So thank you so much. The thing is that I wanted to remind. 2 things.